Hello, BookTube. We're not going to delay this any longer. You have given me so much patience. We're going to get straight away into a Middlemarch meditation. I once watched a BookTube creator. Now, this is going way back, I think before I started my own channel. And they said that they really enjoyed Middlemarch for about the first 100 or so pages. And then, for them, it got dull. Now, I didn't really understand what they meant by that. And all the while that we've been doing these meditations, I thought, no, this book is quite fascinating. However, I'm beginning to understand what they might have meant, because this section, this book 2, and the chapter in book 1, the last chapter in book 1 that kind of led into it, that introduced us to the Vinceys, the Featherstones, the Bulstrodes, and the name of the next family is going to escape me, but don't worry, I'll remember it shortly. Lidgett, Dr. Lidgett. That section, it's so different than book 1 that concentrated on Dorothea Brooke. The story just seems to be about what it is about. There's no symbolism. I seem to find less depth in the writing, less rabbit holes that we can go down together. And okay, that's not the end of the world. Some narratives are like that, but it's just interesting that we have had such a different piece of writing leading up to book 2. And I've been reading Rosemary Ashton's biography of George Eliot, and it's interesting that around the time she started Middlemarch, and you'll remember that she started Middlemarch with the Vincey Featherstone Lidgett story, not with Dorothea Brooke. Dorothea Brooke came later. So when she started the book, her personal life, there were a lot of tough things going on. For starters, George Henry Lewes, her partner, his oldest son, who was nicknamed Thorny, had been out with his younger brother in Natal in southern Africa. And he'd come down with an illness, the symptoms of which no doctor could really understand or treat properly. And he came home to England having lost a considerable amount of weight, and he literally collapsed in their front parlor. And even though they had visitors, he was in that much pain. They tried to nurse him as best they could, tried to get him good medical help, but to no avail. Within a few months of returning to England, Thorny died, and he was only 25. Rosemary Ashton's biography uses the word unconfident to describe how Eliot was feeling about the first 50 pages of Middlemarch, which she wrote during this time. And I can't imagine the stress and how difficult it would be for her to concentrate. And it would be another year before she began to think of the character of Dorothea Brooke, and then began that part of the novel. And so I agree with that booktuber that this part of book 2 seems a little dry. It seems to lack an overarching theme, some depth, something which Dorothea Brooke's story actually gives the novel. But today we're going to cover the first 4 pages of chapter 14, and we're going to start, of course, with the epigraph, which I will read. Follows here the strict receipt for that sauce to dainty meat named idleness, which many eat by preference, and call it sweet. First watch for morsels like a hound, mix well with buffets, stir them round with good thick oil of flatteries, and froth with mean, self-lauding lies. Serve warm. The vessels you must choose to keep it in are dead men's shoes. I did not find anything online to help me with this epigraph. Even Adam Roberts' book, which is all about the epigraphs in Middlemarch, doesn't want to touch this one. And I don't want to apologize for it, but yet I feel I should. I don't feel it's the greatest epigraph compared to some of the others where you really can go down into depth. We'll do a little vocabulary check to start with. Receipt. For those of you living outside the UK, there's a second meaning of receipt in United Kingdom English that you may not know. When I grew up in Canada, a receipt was the thing that you got at a store after you'd made a purchase. That was it. When I came to England, I realized that it was also an old-fashioned word for a recipe. A food, a cooking recipe, in other words. So follows here, a strict receipt means here is the recipe for that sauce to dainty meat, dainty meaning anything, any delicacy, named idleness. So this now is right away reminding me of those morality verses, the kind of things that you would get on Victorian embroidery samplers. Does anybody know those? I'm going to put a picture of one up on screen because I think this particular poem, had George Eliot read it, would have irked her no end. I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to let you read it. But basically what it's saying is, women don't write. Don't. That's not, you're out of your, not just out of your comfort zone. You were just, I don't even have the words for it. The poem says it all, doesn't it? The natural place for writing and literature and thinking like that is with men. You just know Eliot would be furious. I don't think it counts as a spoiler to say that the point of this little verse, which I don't think is well written, I think it is George Eliot's, and writers who have critiqued her poetry say that not all of her poetry was really great, and I don't think this one is either, but it is aimed at Fred. If we read the recipe itself, first watch for morsels like a hound, mix well with buffets, stir them round. Buffets are blows, so a buffet could be something that you deal out or that you receive. And if I have a criticism of this poem, is that it's not clear from this line whether the person who's making up this recipe for idleness is receiving blows or giving blows. And I don't really understand. And stir them round with good thick oil of flatteries and froth with mean self-lauding lies. I think what it is saying is if you want to be idle, what you're going to have to do is watch to see when there's something going that you can have without working for it. I'm not sure what it means, mix well with buffets. I don't know if that means you have to fight for some things or you have to endure people beating on you, whatever it takes. And then, of course, good thick oil of flatteries and self-lauding lies means you probably have to do a lot of talking to charm people into giving you something that you haven't worked for as well. And, of course, it says, serve warm. The vessels, you must choose to keep it in our dead men's shoes. Well, it's a warning, isn't it? All these little morality verses always have a warning. If you don't do this, this will happen. This epigraph is perhaps more for our next Middlemarch meditation, but we'll see. We'll come back to it when we can. For now, we'll just start in to chapter 14. Mr. Bulstrode's consultation of Harriet seemed to have had the effect desired by Mr. Vincey, for early the next morning a letter came, which Fred could carry to Mr. Featherstone as the required testimony. The old gentleman was staying in bed on account of the cold weather, and as Mary Garth was not to be seen in the sitting-room, Fred went upstairs immediately and presented the letter to his uncle, who, propped up comfortably on a bed rest, was not less able than usual to enjoy his consciousness of wisdom in distrusting and frustrating mankind. He put on his spectacles to read the letter, pursing up his lips and drawing down their corners. I would like to make that face. I like how Eliot has described the expression that Featherstone makes. He purses his lips, so, and then he draws down the corner. So if we do that together, And it's just such, I can picture his face. I really can. In fact, I'm picturing Ian McClellan playing Featherstone. I'm not sure McClellan would want that role. There is another actor I've got in mind, but I cannot make his name come to my memory. That's my short-term memory. Very bad these days. Two things occur to me after we read that first paragraph. The first is Mary Garth, that Fred is expecting her to be in a particular part of the house, which is interesting. It makes me wonder, with both Mary Garth and Mr. Featherstone, just how restricted and interior their lives are. I mean, we know that with Mr. Featherston, he cannot move around. And so if he has to be in bed, that's probably where he'll be all day. Everything will have to be brought to him. And if he doesn't get any visitors, then he doesn't get any visitors. And Mary, it seems, as we'll see as we read on, is at his beck and call. So she can never be far away. It means her life is very interior and very restricted. For both of these people, there must be a lot of frustration. And I don't know if that helps, because Mr. Featherston, I don't think, is meant to be a character that you like. But I wonder if it helps one's sympathy with him a little bit to understand that he's in pain very often, that he can hardly move, and that he has to ask everybody for everything, which probably wasn't the way his life was earlier on. He probably had the ability to move about and do what he wanted. And that his propensity to cause frustration for other people, to give other people pain, is perhaps his only way of venting his frustration, that he has so much pain. But we must read this letter. Here we go. Under the circumstances, I will not decline to state my conviction. Tcha! What fine words the fellow puts. He's as fine as an auctioneer. That your son Frederick has not obtained any advance of money on bequests promised by Mr. Featherston. Promised? Who said I ever promised? I promised nothing. I shall make codicils as long as I like. And that, considering the nature of such a proceeding, it is unreasonable to presume that a young man of sense and character would attempt it. Ah, but the gentleman doesn't say you are a young man of sense and character. Mark you that, sir. As to my own concern with any report of such a nature, I distinctly affirm that I never made any statement to the effect that your son had borrowed money on any property that might accrue to him on Mr. Featherston's demise. Bless my heart, property, accrue, demise. Lawyer Standish is nothing to him. He couldn't speak finer if he wanted to borrow. Well, Mr. Featherston here looked over his spectacles at Fred while he handed back the letter to him with a contemptuous gesture. You don't suppose I believe a thing because Bulstrode writes it out fine, eh? So here is Mr. Featherston's first act of frustration. He will do many in this section, but he reads a letter very quickly, hands it back with a contemptuous gesture, and basically says, well, you don't think I trust anything that's written there, do you? And you think, well, you can understand Fred's frustration, having gone to all the embarrassment. And perhaps that's all Mr. Featherston wanted to do, was to cause Fred incredible embarrassment and inconvenience again, because it's the only relief. And I'm not saying this to excuse Mr. Featherston, but I can understand how a person under a great deal of stress every day as a result of their illness and their isolation and their helplessness, I can understand how they might, when they see a healthy person walk into the room, someone who can do whatever they want, I can understand why they might choose to make that person experience stress as well, just to remind them that I, here, me, the ill person, I suffer every day and no one really notices. It could also be that Mr. Featherston is trying, as best he can, to teach Fred to be less of a fool, to learn to distrust a little, to learn to be more careful, more reticent, more careful with money. By making him go through this humiliation, perhaps Mr. Featherston hopes, well, he won't repeat this mistake because he won't want to go through all this again. We read on. Fred coloured. You wished to have the letter, sir. I should think it very likely that Mr. Bulstrode's denial is as good as the authority which told you what he denies. Every bit. I never said I believed either one or the other. And now, what do you expect? Said Mr. Featherston curtly, keeping on his spectacles, but withdrawing his hands under his wraps. I expect nothing, sir. Fred, with difficulty, restrained himself from venting his irritation. I came to bring you the letter. If you like, I will bid you good morning. Not yet, not yet. Ring the bell. I want Missy to come. It was a servant who came in answer to the bell. Tell Missy to come, said Mr. Featherstone impatiently. What business had she to go away? He spoke in the same tone when Mary came. Why couldn't you sit still here till I told you to go? I want my waistcoat now. I told you always to put it on the bed. Mary's eyes looked rather red, as if she had been crying. It was clear that Mr. Featherstone was in one of his most snappish humours this morning, and though Fred had now the prospect of receiving the much-needed present of money, he would have preferred being free to turn round on the old tyrant and tell him that Mary Garth was too good to be at his beck. Though Fred had risen as she entered the room, she had barely noticed him, and looked as if her nerves were quivering with the expectation that something would be thrown at her. But she never had anything worse than words to dread, and when she went to reach the waistcoat from a peg, Fred went up to her and said, "Allow me." I don't find anything to remark on there, apart from the fact that the servant came in answer to the bell first, rather than Mary, and I can only assume that that bell is for Mary, and if the servant came, I presume that Mary was not yet in a state where she wanted to be in front of her uncle. Perhaps she was crying, needed to dry her eyes, and so the servant took pity on her and decided to answer the bell and see if they could help cover for Mary a little bit, buy her some time, maybe. "Let it alone. You bring it, Missy, and lay it down here," said Mr. Featherstone. "Now you go away again, till I call you," he added, when the waistcoat was laid down by him. It was usual with him to season his pleasure in showing favour to one person by being especially disagreeable to another, and Mary was always at hand to furnish the condiment. When his own relatives came, she was treated better. Slowly, he took out a bunch of keys from the waistcoat pocket, and slowly he drew forth a tin box which was under the bedclothes. "You expect I'm going to give you a little fortune, eh?" he said, looking above his spectacles and pausing in the act of opening the lid. The theatre of this you could talk about the theatricality of Featherstone here. Absolutely. These little performances, again, they may be the only way he can give himself the satisfaction of having an effect on the world outside his house. There really is no other way. And I know he's not meant to be a character that you are in sympathy with, but you could make a comment here about age and ageism, is that it's easy to create an older character that a reader will dislike, because it's very easy to create an older character who is lonely, who is ill, who is under stress, because as you get older, all the people that you know begin to die. It is something that Jane Campbell, in her book of short stories, Cat Brushing, remarks on. She talks about how the business of aging is the business of being slowly stripped of things you used to have. If you retire from your job, then you're no longer recognized as that skilled person, whatever skill it was you had. Once you retire, you're just an old person who's retired. You lose people that you knew for years and years and years because they get older too and they die. You get to watch as the world changes, and maybe you can or cannot keep up with those changes. You're on a limited income. So there's many, many things that can cause an older person to be under a lot of stress and therefore not to be particularly pleasant company. So I think a person should bear that in mind when you get an older character who's like Featherstone, who's difficult, and your initial response is, I don't like them much either, is to just bear in mind that it's easy to create a dislikable character who's older because the number of stresses on them. And of course, they're approaching mortality. You can't get away from it. And particularly if you've got an illness, it just reminds you on a daily basis. "Not at all, sir. You were good enough to speak of making me a present the other day, else, of course, I should not have thought of the matter." But Fred was of a hopeful disposition, and a vision had presented itself of a sum just large enough to deliver him from a certain anxiety. When Fred got into debt, it always seemed to him highly probable that something or other, he did not necessarily conceive what, would come to pass, enabling him to pay in due time. And now that the providential occurrence was apparently close at hand, it would have been sheer absurdity to think that the supply would be short of the need, as absurd as a faith that believed in half a miracle for want of strength to believe in a whole one. The deep-veined hands fingered many banknotes one after the other, laying them down flat again, while Fred leaned back in his chair, scorning to look eager. He held himself to be a gentleman at heart, and did not like courting an old fellow for his money. At last, Mr. Featherstone eyed him again over his spectacles, and presented him with a little sheaf of notes. Fred could see distinctly that there were but 5, as the less significant edges gaped towards him. But then each might mean £50. He took them, saying, "I am very much obliged to you, sir," and was going to roll them up without seeming to think of their value. But this did not suit Mr. Featherstone, who was eyeing him intently. "Come, don't you think it worth your while to count 'em? You take money like a lord. I suppose you lose it like one." "I thought it was not to look a gift horse in the mouth, sir, but I shall be very happy to count them." 3 things from this passage. First of all, Fred Vincey's very peculiar faith. And we noted from the number of words, and you can see that I colored them in yellow, the number of words that are either distinctly religious or they are allusions to biblical phrases that are often used. So you have hopeful, vision, deliver, come to pass. Now, my little marginal notes, come to pass appears in the King James Version of the Bible 457 times. And it's that common a phrase that if you read the Bible enough, the word come to pass will immediately send your mind back thinking about the scriptures. And then, of course, close at hand. That occurs 20 times, not so often. Is at hand, the time is at hand, occurs a little bit more often. But nevertheless, the phrase will resonate. And then you have faith, of course, and miracle. So there's lots of religious words all in this paragraph. And it shows this is where Fred's faith is. It's a faith that somehow he will come out of all his bad scrapes. He doesn't know how, but whatever comes to him, it will work out. It will be just right. It's interesting too, as you drop down then to his last remark. "I thought I was not to look a gift horse in the mouth, sir." I think everyone knows that phrase, but I will just say it anyway. To look a gift horse in the mouth. It is not an English phrase. It is lifted and altered from a 4th century proverb by St. Jerome. And let's see if I can read the Latin correctly from my notes. It is, "Equi dentes inspicere donati," meaning to inspect the teeth of a gifted horse, because you can tell the age of a horse from its teeth. And so if you were given a horse as a gift, it was considered rude to inspect the teeth in front of the giver, because you were showing that perhaps you didn't trust the giver. Also, what you received you had not earned, and therefore what right did you have to expect a certain standard of quality? Fred doesn't look a gift horse in the mouth, but nevertheless he certainly does have an expectation of exactly what that horse, if we can use that word metaphorically, what that's going to be. Fred was not so happy, however, after he had counted them, for they actually presented the absurdity of being less than his hopefulness had decided that they must be. What can the fitness of things mean, if not their fitness to a man's expectations? Failing this, absurdity and atheism gape behind him. The collapse for Fred was severe when he found that he held no more than 5 20s, and his share in the higher education of this country did not seem to help him. Nevertheless, he said with rapid changes in his fair complexion, "It is very handsome of you, sir." "I should think it is," said Mr. Featherstone, locking his box and replacing it, then taking off his spectacles deliberately, and at length, as if his inward meditation had more deeply convinced him, repeating, "I should think it is handsome." "I assure you, sir, I am very grateful," said Fred, who had had time to recover his cheerful air. "So you ought to be. You want to cut a figure in the world, and I reckon Peter Featherston is the only one you've got to trust to." Here the old man's eyes gleamed with a curiously mingled satisfaction in the consciousness that this smart young fellow relied upon him, and that the smart young fellow was rather a fool for doing so. Taking off his spectacles deliberately, and that long pause, which seems to give, it must be pretty long because it gives Fred enough time to recover his composure after he realizes that instead of being given 5 50-pound notes, he's been given 5 20-pound notes. He's been given £100, which is an incredible amount of money. I should have looked up how much it would be. I will look it up, and I will put it on screen here so you can see what the today's value of £100 would have been. Because I think that's important, because it is a handsome gift. It's just that Fred had another amount in mind, as we see. What I would like to understand is, what is Featherston's long game with all this? Does he have one? At first I thought he was really favoring Fred, that he saw Fred as the best person to give his land to. Now I'm thinking, no, you quite clearly see that this young man is a fool and you're playing him. But what's your long game? What do you want out of this in the long run? Or do you? Is this just amusing you and passing the time? Is it just giving your dull life some excitement? Or do you hope that all these things you do will finally turn Fred Vincy into someone more circumspect, someone more careful, someone more canny with money? I mean, I don't hold out much hope, but nevertheless, I'm just trying to understand, what does Mr. Featherston think of all this? We read on. "Yes, indeed, I was not born to very splendid chances. Few men have been more cramped than I have been," said Fred, with some sense of surprise at his own virtue, considering how hardly he was dealt with. "It really seems a little too bad to have to ride a broken-winded hunter, and see men who are not half such good judges as yourself able to throw away any amount of money on buying bad bargains." "Well, you can buy yourself a fine hunter now. £80 is enough for that, I reckon, and you'll have £20 over to get yourself out of any little scrape," said Mr. Featherston, chuckling slightly. "You are very good, sir," said Fred, with a fine sense of contrast between the words and his feeling. "I rather a better uncle than your fine Uncle Bulstrode. You won't get much out of his speculations, I think. He's got a pretty strong string round your father's leg, by what I hear, eh?" "My father never tells me anything about his affairs, sir." "Well, he shows some sense there, but other people find him out without his telling. He'll never have much to leave you. He'll most like die without a will. He's the sort of man to do it. Let him make him mayor of Middlemarch as much as they like, but you won't get much by his dying without a will, though you are the eldest son." Fred thought that Mr. Featherston had never been so disagreeable before. True, he had never given him quite so much money at once. "Shall I destroy this letter of Mr. Bulstrode's, sir?" said Fred, rising with the letter as if he would put it in the fire. I don't want it. It's worth no money to me." Fred carried the letter to the fire and thrust the poker through it with much zest. He longed to get out of the room, but he was a little ashamed before his inner self, as well as before his uncle, to run away immediately after pocketing the money. Presently, the farm bailiff came up to give his master a report, and Fred, to his unspeakable relief, was dismissed with the injunction to come again soon. I think what's interesting is the phrase that's used here, "throw away any amount of money." That seems to be Fred's ambition. And if I haven't said it before, I think he gets that ambition from his time at university, where he would have seen young men who were born to aristocratic families, who would have had annual allowances amounting to several £100s, and they could waste money. They could buy something or lose money, be able to pay off debts quite easily. Fred isn't in that position. But unfortunately, both he and Rosamond, it seems, have an ambition to step up in life. And yes, culturally, for the English middle class, that was always an aspiration. I think Fred and Rosamond are trying to jump too high at once and also trying to make their leap, thinking that it can happen without a great deal of effort, strategy on their part. And that's not the case. Fred probably would have been better off, socially speaking, if he had become a member of the clergy. That would have made him more like Mr. Cadwallader. He obviously was not of an aristocratic family, because Mrs. Cadwallader says she married beneath herself. But obviously she married for love, so he must have become a clergyman. His family maybe saved up. They were also mercantile, saved up, sent Mr. Cadwallader to university. He became a clergyman, and therefore he could then begin to socialize with aristocracy, and then Mr. and Mrs. Cadwallader fell in love. That's a bit of good fortune, but it has elevated Mr. Cadwallader such that he can keep better company now than he once would have. So Fred wants to make a jump, but I think he wants to go over the level of clergy, actually into the level of landed aristocracy. I don't think he's really thought through what might be involved there. Usually to become landed aristocracy and to be accepted amongst the upper classes, you also need a title. And to get a title, you often have to, one of your ancestors or you have to go to battle. You have to go into war and you have to win some territory for a king or give a king a lot of land. Well, this is the 19th century. That opportunity isn't really happening yet. So Fred, I understand Fred's frustration, but he and Rosamond, I think both, are wanting to take too great a leap. And Mr. Featherstone's fishing for information. Is your father obliged to Mr. Bulstrode in any way? That strong string? And Fred denies all knowledge, and he probably doesn't have it. I agree. But Mr. Featherstone seems to have knowledge already. And again, I don't know why he's doing this, why he's goading Fred, unless it is to bring Fred closer to him. It's either that or he just sees Fred as a stupid, vulnerable young man, and he gets some pleasure out of exploiting him for his vulnerability. I hope it's not the latter, but sometimes I wonder. I'm not sure where the good-heartedness in Mr. Featherstone is, if it exists at all. And I'm very concerned that the letter was burnt. That bothers me a great deal. I don't think Fred should have burnt that letter. I think he just wanted to get the whole thing gone since he saw that the letter meant nothing to Mr. Featherstone. But I don't like that Mr. Featherstone agreed to that. I just think, is this going to be another test? Is this going to come back to haunt Fred, this decision? I don't know. But it's making me nervous, because the whole situation between these two men makes me nervous. I can't tell if it's exploitative. I can't tell whether Mr. Featherstone means Fred ultimate good, is trying to teach him to be more circumspect, wiser, less trusting, all that stuff. I can't tell what Mr. Featherstone's long game is. And that is our Middlemarch meditation done until next Sunday. Because, of course, next Sunday we will begin Middlemarch March. And I think what I'll do is make a little schedule so you can all see just how many episodes you're getting where we're actually looking at the text of the book itself. Because what I also want to do during March is read those 2 books that I showed you that I bought in London. Those 2, I want to read them and I want to do vlogs about them. I want that to fill up maybe the midweek section to some degree. We shall see. We shall see how I go. But we'll try and get a schedule together for you next week. So in the meantime, everybody, happy reading. Have a good Sunday. I'll talk to you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.